第二单元文化教育课文口译一英汉口译
Ladies and gentlemen, my topic today is We don't speak the same language as the Americans. It was said by Sir George Bernard Shaw that England and America are two countries separated by the same language. My first personal experience of this was when I worked as a camp counselor for 2 months in 2000 in a summer camp run by the Boy Scouts of America as part of an international leader exchange scheme. Before I went, all the participants in the scheme were given a short list of words that are in common use in the UK, which Americans would either be confused by or would even offend them. I memorized the words and thought, I'll cope. When I finally arrived in the States 3 months later, I realized that perhaps a lifetime of watching American television was not adequate preparation for appreciating and coping with the differences between American and British speech. In the first hour of arriving at the camp, I was exposed to high school American English, Black American English, and the American English spoken by Joe Public, all very different to each other. Needless to say, I did cope in the end. The Americans I met were very welcoming and helpful, and I found they were patient with me when I made a social faux pas, when I used an inappropriate word or phrase. Upon my return, I began to wonder whether anyone had documented the differences between American and British English. I found several books on the subject, but often these were written in a dry and academic way. So today, I'd like to take this chance to share with you some of my personal experiences which may help you understand better how both sides of Atlantic speak differently. My research into the subject led me to several conclusions. Firstly, American English and British English are converging thanks to increased transatlantic travel and the media. The movement of slang words is mostly eastwards, though a few words from the UK have been adopted by the Ivy League fraternities. This convergent trend is a recent one, dating from the emergence of Hollywood as the predominant filmmaking centre in the world, and also from the Second World War, when large numbers of American GIs were stationed in the UK. This trend was consolidated by the advent of television. Before then, it was thought that American English and British English would diverge as the two languages evolved. Very few people in Britain realize how many of the words they use are of American origin. Often, this importation of American words has encountered a linguistic snobbery by the British, which was a manifestation of the cultural snobbery that bedeviled Anglo-American relationships for a long time. This is not, thankfully, the case now. Secondly, there are some generalizations that can be made about American and British English which can reveal the nature of the two nations and their peoples. British speech tends to be less general and directed more in nuances of meaning at a subgroup of the population. This has become a kind of code in which few words are spoken because each, along with its attendant murmurings and pauses, carries a wealth of shared assumptions and attitudes. In other words, the British are preoccupied with their social status within society and speak and act accordingly to fit into the social class they aspire to. This is particularly evident when talking to someone from the middle class. He points out that he is upper middle class rather than middle class or lower middle class. John Major, the former UK Prime Minister, may have said that we are now living in a classless society, but the class system still prevails. At that moment, both he and the leader of the opposition, Tony Blair, were talking about capturing the Middle England, middle-class vote, as the key to winning the next general election. American speech tends to be influenced by the overheated language of much of the media, which is designed to attach an impression of exciting activity to passive, if sometimes insignificant, events. Yet, curiously, really violent activity and life-changing events are hidden in bland, antiseptic tones that serve to disguise the reality. Two examples come readily to mind. The US military, with their friendly fire, and collateral damages, and the business world with their downsizing. British people tend to understatement, whereas Americans towards hyperbole. A Briton might respond to a question with a word such as terrific, only if he's expressing rapturous enthusiasm, whereas an American might use the word merely to signify polite assent. Thirdly, the American language has less regard than the British for grammatical form, and will happily bulldoze its way across distinctions rather than steer a path between them. American English will casually use one form of a word for another, for example, turning nouns into verbs, or verbs and nouns into adjectives. In Britain, a disrespect for grammatical rules, particularly amongst the middle classes, would immediately reveal you to be not one of us. Listening to listener feedback on programs on Radio 4, a radio station run by the British Broadcasting Corporation of BBS, would reveal this. People actually write to complain about grammatical mistakes made by news presenters. Amongst young British people, this is not necessarily the case. British teenagers have long been accused of being poorly educated by politicians, parents, and employers, since they have little regard for grammar in their speech. As a consequence of American culture and speech patterns being commonplace on children's television programs in the UK, I have noted that most young British children of my acquaintance now play with their toys in an American accent, with the attendant syntax and grammatical structure. American teenagers have taken this disregard for grammatical form one step further and have almost abandoned syntax altogether. For example, a teenage girl might describe the first time she met her new boyfriend by saying, "I looked at him and I was like, whoa." I do hope what I've said will be of some help for all to learn about the language difference in the United States and Britain. Thanks.
2. 汉英口译。中华文明是世界古代文明中始终没有中断、连续5000多年发展至今的文明。中华民族在漫长历史发展中形成的独具特色的文化传统，深深影响了古代中国，也深深影响着当代中国。现时代中国强调的以人为本、与时俱进、社会和谐、和平发展，既有着中华文明的深厚根基，又体现了时代发展的进步精神。中华文明历来注重以民为本，尊重人的尊严和价值。早在千百年前，中国人就提出民为邦本，本固邦宁，天地之间莫贵于人，强调要利民、育民、养民、惠民。今天我们坚持以人为本，就是要坚持发展为了人民，发展依靠人民，发展成果由人民共享，关注人的价值、权益和自由，关注人的生活质量、发展潜能和幸福指数，最终是为了实现人的全面发展。保障人民的生存权和发展权仍是中国的首要任务。我们将大力推动经济社会发展，依法保障人民享有自由、民主和人权，实现社会公平和正义，使13亿中国人民过上幸福生活。中华文明历来注重自强不息，不断革故鼎新，天行健，君子以自强不息，这是中国的一句千年传世格言。中华民族所以能在5000多年的历史进程中生生不息，发展壮大，历经挫折而不屈，屡遭坎坷而不馁，靠的就是这样一种发愤图强、坚韧不拔、与时俱进的精神。中国人民在改革开放中表现出来的进取精神，在建设国家中焕发出来的创造热情，在克服前进道路上的各种困难中表现出来的顽强毅力，正是这种自强不息精神的生动写照。中华文明历来注重社会和谐，强调团结互助。中国人早就提出了和为贵的思想，追求天人和谐、人际和谐、身心和谐，向往人人相亲、人人平等、天下为公的理想社会。今天，中国提出构建和谐社会， 就是要建设一个民主法治、公平正义、诚信友爱、充满活力、安定有序、人与自然和谐相处的社会，实现物质和精神、民主和法治、公平和效率、活力和秩序的有机统一。中国人民把维护民族团结作为自己义不容辞的职责，把维护国家主权和领土完整作为自己至高无上的使命。一切有利于民族团结和国家统一的行为都会得到中国人民真诚的欢迎和拥护，一切有损于民族团结和国家统一的举动都会遭到中国人民强烈的反抗和抗争。中华文明历来注重亲仁善邦，讲求和睦相处。中华民族历来爱好和平。中国人在对外关系中始终秉承强不执弱、富不侮贫的精神，主张协和万邦。中国人提倡海纳百川，有容乃大，主张吸纳百家悠长，兼具八方精义。今天，中国高举和平、发展、合作的旗帜，奉行独立自主的和平外交政策，坚定不移地走和平发展道路，既通过维护世界和平来发展自己，又通过自己的发展来促进世界和平。中国坚持实施互利共赢的对外开放战略，真诚愿意同各国广泛开展合作，真诚愿意兼收并蓄，博采各种文明之长，以合作谋和平，以合作促发展，推动建设一个持久和平、共同繁荣的和谐世界。口译实践一，英汉口译。
20 years ago, many commentators in the United States were extolling the virtues of Japanese management practices, worrying about Japan's large trade surpluses, and predicting that Japan would soon overtake the United States as the world's leading economic power. In the first 4 decades after the Second World War, Japan's productivity and GDP rose more rapidly than that of the United States. Yet after 1990, Japan stagnated for 15 years, only recently resuming a reasonable pace of economic growth. What happened? The conventional story is that excessive corporate debt and a rigid financial system, hampered by an unwise deflationary monetary policy, put the brakes on Japanese growth. This is a partial truth, but if we end the explanation there, we would fail to recognize a more profound underlying cause of Japan's slowdown. In the 1950s and 1960s, Japan's growth was propelled by the same fuel that drives China today: a high savings rate and a large pool of underemployed labor, which allows manufacturing to boom without driving up wages. By the 1970s, Japan had absorbed its surplus labor, and a new growth dynamic took over: attention to quality and efficiency in manufacturing. But Japan's edge did not survive the IT revolution of the 1990s. Innovation in software and communications technology gave the United States a decisive productivity advantage. Japan could not innovate fast enough, and it fell into a 15-year slump. If you are not convinced by this argument, try the following mental experiment. Imagine that Microsoft, Netscape, Apple, and Google were Japanese companies. Would Japanese growth in the 1990s have lagged so far behind the United States? I think not. The brilliance of China's leadership is that it had foresightedly recognized the reasons for Japan's failure to innovate, and it is already taking steps to prepare China for a future, perhaps 2 decades away, in which it can no longer compete globally and win on the basis of low labor costs. Understanding that China must learn to innovate, President Hu Jintao had made innovation and creativity the centerpiece of his current 5-year plan. Avoiding the fate of Japan won't be without its challenges. The secret lies in acknowledging the 3 principal factors that have contributed to America's decisive advantage in innovation, and then doing something about each of them. The first requisite is for China to achieve world-class stature in basic scientific research, not just in applied engineering, because basic science is the ultimate source from which all applied technology flows. The second requisite is that China's educational system must encourage its graduates to think creatively and independently. And the third is for China to develop a financial system with the flexibility to support high-risk startup enterprises, which generate a disproportionate share of transformational innovations. In this third area, China is already taking measures that Japan long resisted by gradually opening its major financial institutions to foreign partnerships and encouraging the rise of a new venture capital sector. Let me dwell a bit longer on China's approach to the first and second requirements for innovation. China is investing heavily in science and higher education. Total central government expenditure on universities grew by a factor of 7 between 1995 and 2002. To cite a couple of striking examples, Shanghai Jiaotong University has built more than 275,000 square meters of state-of-the-art science and engineering labs on its sprawling new campus, while IBM, Intel, and Microsoft built major facilities in the adjacent industrial park. And Peking University's Institute of Microelectronics has built 2 state-of-the-art semiconductor fabrication lines, each employing a different advanced technology. No U.S. university has a comparable facility. China's leading universities are also making a conscious effort to attract back the rest of those who had gone abroad for PhD study. For established faculty from the West, several top schools are now offering salaries and housing allowances designed to match the standard of living on U.S. campuses. Peking and Fudan universities have established large laboratories for leading U.S. scientists of Chinese origin, in both cases, Yale geneticists. This type of investment creates tremendous spillover for China as it permits younger faculty and graduate students to work in close proximity with some of the best scientists in the world. Even more interesting than China's investment in science is its recognition that pedagogy needs to change. Some senior national leaders have come to believe that the traditional Chinese deference to the authority of the professor discourages independent thinking and thus potentially limits China's development as an innovator. These leaders note that the top colleges and universities of the West encourage their students to speak up in class, challenge their professors, question conventional wisdom, develop problem-solving skills, and think independently. This pedagogical approach is believed to be more conducive than passive learning to producing the kind of flexible, adaptive, and creative engineers and business leaders who drive innovation. Elite universities in China are also looking with interest at abandoning the specialized undergraduate curriculum imported from Europe and the Soviet Union in favor of the American-style liberal arts curriculum, in which students study a variety of subjects to gain breadth and flexibility before specializing in a major field of study. Some of the top universities are also experimenting with criteria other than scores on national examinations to admit students, in order to favor candidates with high potential for creativity and contribution to society. Yale has been pleased and privileged to play a central role in all these educational reforms that I just outlined. In collaboration with the Ministry of Education, we have worked with the presidents, party secretaries, and vice presidents of China's top universities for each of the past 3 summers, sharing with them best U.S. practices in the areas of strategic planning, recruiting faculty, supporting world-class research, curriculum, and pedagogy. Over the years, the focus has gradually migrated from a study of U.S. practices on the very impressive progress of reform in China. We look forward to continuing involvement in this very exciting evolution.
2. 汉英口译。各位新闻界的朋友们、同志们，家庭经济困难学生的就学生活问题牵动着整个社会，新闻界的朋友们一直非常关心，对此我深表感谢。胡锦涛总书记多次强调，教育涉及千家万户，惠及子孙后代，是体现发展为了人民、发展依靠人民、发展成果由人民共享的重要方面， 保证人民享有接受教育的机会，是党和政府义不容辞的职责，也是促进社会公平正义、构建社会主义和谐社会的客观要求。教育公平是重要的社会公平，树立和落实科学发展观，要求我们必须坚持教育优先发展，把促进教育公平作为国家基本教育政策，努力使教育体现出最大的社会公平，让所有的孩子都能圆上学梦，都能上得起学，上好学。改革开放以来，特别是世纪之交，我国教育事业的发展实现了历史性跨越，成绩巨大，改革取得了突破性进展，方向正确，为数以亿计的青少年学子提供了有可能改变他们一生命运的机会。我们建立了农村义务教育经费保障机制，大力发展职业教育，切实提高高等教育质量等等。所有这一切努力都是为了统筹城乡区域教育的协调发展，统筹各级各类教育的协调发展，统筹教育发展的规模、结构、质量，从根本上来说，都是为了促进教育公平，努力保障人民群众享有接受良好教育的机会。保证家庭经济困难学生能够上得起学，能够上好学，是促进教育公平的重要方面。促进我国教育事业持续协调健康发展，必须巩固成果，深化改革，提高质量，持续发展。必须认真研究解决教育改革发展中的一些深层次问题，其中重要的一条是切实解决好家庭经济困难学生的资助问题。党中央、国务院高度重视家庭经济困难学生的资助工作，国家采取了一系列政策措施，不断加大资助家庭经济困难学生的力度。义务教育阶段全部免除了农村义务教育阶段学生的学杂费，同时为家庭经济困难学生免费提供教科书和寄宿生生活补助。职业教育阶段设立了中等职业学校国家助学金，高等教育阶段逐步形成了奖贷助补减有机结合的高校家庭经济困难学生资助政策体系。这些工作取得了较好成果，但是还远远不够，需要进一步改进和完善。温家宝总理在今年的政府工作报告中郑重宣布，从今年新学年开始，在普通本科高校、高等职业学校和中等职业学校建立健全国家奖学金、助学金制度，同时进一步落实国家助学贷款政策，使家庭经济困难学生都能上得起大学，接受职业教育。这是继全部免除农村义务教育阶段学杂费之后，促进教育公平的又一件大事，充分体现了社会主义制度的优越性，是推进社会主义和谐社会建设的重要行动，意义重大，影响深远。新的资助政策体系概括起来可以用一句话表述：每年资助500亿，受助学生2000万。具体的说，今后每年用于助学的中央和地方财政投入，学校安排的助学经费将达到500亿元，受助学生约2000万，其中包括400万大学生和1600万中职学生。我国高等教育从此将形成国家奖学金、国家励志奖学金、国家助学金、国家助学贷款、勤工助学、学费减免等多种形式的高校家庭经济困难学生政策资助体系。中等职业教育国家助学金将资助所有全日制在校农村学生和城市家庭经济困难学生。建立国家助学金、学生工学结合、顶岗实习、半工半读、学校减免学费等多种形式的资助政策体系。新的资助政策体系的建立，将使所有家庭经济困难学生都能上得起大学，接受职业教育，让所有孩子都能上得起学，都能上好学，正在逐步成为现实。最近几个月，为了推进新的资助政策体系的落实，按照中央的部署，财政部、教育部积极配合，地方各级政府采取了一系列切实措施，各高等学校、中等职业学校做了大量工作。目前，新的资助政策推进工作顺利，各方面反应良好。党中央、国务院高度重视、亲切关怀教育工作。就在几天前， 8月31日，全国优秀教师代表座谈会在中南海召开。胡锦涛、温家宝等中央领导同志亲切接见了来自全国各地的优秀教师代表。胡锦涛总书记发表了重要讲话，深刻阐述了教育在推动国家发展、实现中华民族伟大复兴中的重要地位和作用，强调指出要继续坚持好、落实好把教育摆在优先发展的战略地位的方针，大力倡导尊师重教，大力发展教育事业。总书记的讲话使广大教师和教育工作者深受鼓舞，倍感振奋。我们将奋发进取，扎实工作，努力办好让人民满意的教育，为我国的社会主义现代化建设，为中华民族的伟大复兴做出新的更大的贡献。